There's a barn cat on my parents' farm named Butter who just turned 21 this spring, still catching mice, still sleeping in the hayloft, and every single person who meets her asks me the same question over and over at every family gathering, every farmer's market table, every time someone spots her stretched out in the sun. What is it about farm cats that lets them live so long? I want to give you an honest answer instead of a comforting one, because the honest answer is more useful. And it starts with something almost nobody wants to hear. For every Butter you have heard about, there were barn cats on that same farm who never made it past 2 years old, and nobody makes videos about those cats. My name is Amish Girl, though that is not the name on my birth certificate. It is just what people started calling this channel years ago, and it stuck. I grew up around barn cats my whole childhood, watched dozens of them come and go, and later spent 4 years working the front desk and assisting at a small animal veterinary clinic, which is where I actually learned why some cats make it to 20 and most do not. Growing up, I never once questioned the story everyone told about farm cats. It felt obvious, watched with my own eyes every summer, cats roaming free, eating mice, living what looked like a natural, healthy life compared to the pampered indoor cats my cousins in town kept. It was not until I started working alongside veterinarians, seeing what actually came through those doors and what did not, that I realized how much of that story depended entirely on which cats I happened to still be seeing and how many I had simply stopped thinking about once they disappeared from the barn. Quick word before I go further. The old methods my family uses, there is more of it than fits in any one video. I gathered the whole of it into a book you can buy in our pinned comment below. The book is the long version. If you want it, it is there. I will not mention it again. Here is my own failure with this, the one that changed how I think about the whole subject. I used to tell people with total confidence that barn cats simply lived longer because farm life was healthier, more natural, closer to how a cat is supposed to live. I believed it because Butter was proof, standing right there in the hayloft every time I said it. What I left out every single time was Marbles and Pepper and the gray Tom we never even named. 3 cats from that same barn who died of things a vet visit could likely have caught early if any of us had been looking. Marbles disappeared for 2 days and came back barely able to walk. And by the time anyone thought to call a vet, there was very little left to do. Pepper simply stopped showing up one week, the way barn cats sometimes do, and none of us ever learned why, because nobody thought a missing barn cat warranted the kind of search or record keeping a house pet would get. So if someone who grew up watching barn cats and later worked in a vet clinic still spent years repeating a story that only counted the survivors, what makes you think the version of this story you have heard online is not doing the exact same thing to you right now? Here is what almost nobody explains about why the long-lived farm cat story spread so easily. And once you understand it, you will never hear it the same way again. It is survivorship bias, plain and simple. You meet Butter at 21 because Butter is still alive to be met. You never hear about the cats who did not make it because there is no cat standing in a hayloft to prompt the question. Necropsy data from veterinary teaching hospitals actually shows cancer is the single most common cause of death in cats overall, responsible for more than 1/3 of all deaths studied. And outdoor cats face dramatically shorter average lifespans than indoor cats, not longer due to traffic, predators, disease, and exposure. The farm cat story is not fiction. Butter is real. But Butter is the outlier the story is built around, not the rule the story pretends to describe. And building an entire health philosophy around an outlier is exactly how good, caring pet owners end up making decisions that quietly work against the cat they love. Here's the contrast that actually matters. The industry that profits from fear sells a secret, a hidden cause, a villain to blame, because uncertainty is uncomfortable and a simple villain feels better than a complicated truth. The actual research on why some cats live long, healthy lives is not secret at all. It is published, peer-reviewed, and available to any veterinarian who wants to explain it to you, which is precisely why no honest vet would ever need to hide it, and why the ones I worked alongside for years spent so much of every appointment simply explaining it out loud to anyone who asked. Here is the counterintuitive truth that reframes the whole problem. It was never about escaping veterinary medicine. The cats who live the longest are, overwhelmingly, the ones who get the most consistent veterinary attention, not the least, because most of what shortens a cat's life is either preventable or dramatically more treatable when it is caught early. And early is a word that only means anything if someone is actually looking on a regular schedule instead of only when something already looks wrong. Now let me walk you through what the actual research shows shapes a long feline life The version I wish I had understood back when I was only telling half of Butter's story, laid out the same way the vets I worked alongside would actually explain it to a worried owner sitting across the exam table. The first factor is spaying or neutering, and the timing matters more than most people realize. A female cat spayed before her first heat cycle sees her risk of mammary cancer drop by roughly 91% compared to an intact female, and mammary tumors in cats are aggressive, with a median survival time after diagnosis of about a year once they develop. Spaying also removes the risk of uterine and ovarian cancer entirely, and necropsy studies consistently show intact cats of both sexes dying significantly younger than their spayed or neutered counterparts. Butter, it turns out, was spayed as a young cat, something I never once mentioned when I used to tell her story, because at the time I did not understand why it mattered. The second factor is indoor versus outdoor living, and the data here surprises people who grew up, like I did, romanticizing the free-roaming barn cat life. Indoor cats commonly live 15 to 17 years, sometimes well past 20, while cats with regular outdoor access average dramatically shorter lives, often only a fraction of that, driven by vehicle strikes, predators, parasites, and exposure to diseases like feline leukemia virus, which shows up at roughly 3 times the rate in outdoor cats compared to indoor-only cats in the same studies. Butter is not proof that outdoor living is safer. Butter is proof that a cat can beat those odds, which is a very different claim, and one that gets lost every single time someone tells her story, as though it were the norm instead of the exception. The third factor is body weight and diet. Unglamorous, but consistently significant across the research. A cat maintained at a healthy weight through balanced, appropriate portions avoids a cascade of downstream problems, joint strain, diabetes, and a general shortening of healthy years. And the vets I worked alongside spent more time counseling owners on portion control than almost any other single topic during routine visits. More time than they ever spent discussing any single dramatic disease. Because the boring daily habit quietly does more work than any single dramatic intervention ever could. The fourth factor, and this is the one that ties everything else together, is the frequency of actual veterinary screening, not just emergency visits when something already looks wrong. Annual exams for adult cats and twice yearly visits once a cat reaches senior age catch developing problems, including early cancers, while they are still small, localized, and far more treatable than they will be by the time symptoms are obvious enough for an owner to notice on their own. Cats are also famously good at hiding illness, a survival instinct left over from being both predator and prey in the wild, which means the absence of visible symptoms is never reliable evidence that nothing is wrong. I watched this play out more times than I can count at that front desk. An owner bringing in a cat for something minor, a vaccine, a nail trim, only to have the vet catch something entirely unrelated during the routine physical exam that the owner had no idea was even happening. One woman came in purely for a rabies booster and left with a referral for blood work that caught early kidney changes months before she would have noticed anything different at home, simply because the vet happened to be feeling along her cat's abdomen during a completely unrelated appointment. The fifth factor is genetics, and this one is largely outside anyone's control, though worth understanding.
Mixed breed cats, the classic barn cat population Butter belongs to, tend to outlive many purebred lines, likely due to greater genetic diversity, which is a real piece of why farm cats as a category sometimes do beat the averages when they do survive the higher risk environment they are living in. And it is worth saying plainly that genetics is doing real work in Butter's story too, quietly,
alongside everything else. The sixth factor is vaccination and parasite prevention, boring words that do enormous quiet work. Core vaccines and consistent flea, tick, and parasite control protect against several diseases that can significantly shorten a cat's life. And this matters just as much for a barn cat exposed to wildlife and other roaming animals as it does for an indoor pet who occasionally slips out the door. My parents, to their credit, never skipped this part, even in years when other things around the farm were tight, and I think that consistency mattered more than any of us realized at the time. The seventh factor, and the one I actually keep the fullest breakdown of written into the guide because it changes by region and by individual risk factors, is knowing your own cat's specific breed and lifestyle risk profile well enough to ask your vet-pointed questions during routine visits rather than waiting for a general checkup to surface something on its own. A cat with regular outdoor access in an area with high feline leukemia prevalence needs a different conversation than a strictly indoor cat in a low-risk household. And most owners never get that specific with their own vet simply because nobody ever told them the conversation was worth having. Here is the bigger picture underneath all of this. Butter is 21, and I love that cat. And none of what I just told you makes her any less remarkable. What it does is refuse to turn her into evidence for a story that would actually put other people's cats at real risk if they believed it uncritically, skipping vet visits or ignoring early symptoms because they assumed farm life alone was some kind of protection cancer simply could not touch. One of the veterinarians I worked with for years used to say that the cats who live the longest are rarely the luckiest ones. They are the ones whose owners stayed a little bit paranoid in exactly the right way, showing up for the boring annual visit instead of only the dramatic emergency one. I think about that line every time someone asks me Butter's secret because the honest answer is less exciting than a secret and far more useful than one. I think about Marbles and Pepper more than I let on in the moment I mentioned them earlier. Not with guilt exactly, because none of us knew any better at the time, but with a kind of quiet grief that only shows up years later, once you understand what you were actually looking at back then. A barn cat disappearing was just something that happened, background noise on a working farm, and it took working in that clinic to understand how much of that background noise was actually preventable, or at least catchable early enough to matter. If anyone had thought a barn cat's disappearance deserved the same attention a house cat's illness would have gotten. There is a harder truth underneath even that, one I want to say plainly instead of dancing around it. The reason farm cats as a group have shorter average lives has almost nothing to do with the farm itself, and almost everything to do with which of the 7 factors I just walked through tend to go unaddressed in that setting, not because farm families do not care, but because barn cats have historically been treated as working animals rather than pets, spayed less often, vaccinated less consistently, and brought in for checkups far less regularly than an indoor house cat would be. Butter broke that pattern, whether by luck, by my parents' particular habits, or by some combination of both. And that is precisely why her story is worth examining honestly, instead of repeating uncritically. Here's what I want you to do this week. If your cat has not had a checkup in the last year, schedule one, even if nothing looks wrong, especially if nothing looks wrong, because that is exactly the window where an early cancer or developing condition is most treatable and least visible on its own. If your cat is not yet spayed or neutered and there is no specific medical reason your vet has advised against it, ask about timing this week rather than letting it sit on a mental list indefinitely. Tell me in the comments how old your cat is and what their story has been. I read every single one, and if you catch something early because you booked that overdue visit, I want to hear that most of all. If you have your own version of Marbles or Pepper, a cat whose story did not end the way Butter's did, share that too, because I think we owe those cats more honesty than we usually give them, even years later. I still tell people about Butter. She is still remarkable, still the reason strangers stop to ask questions at the farmer's market table every single week. What changed is what I say after the question, the part where I used to stop talking and now I keep going, because a story that only includes the survivor was never the whole story to begin with, and I would rather give you the whole one, even if it is a little less tidy than the version everyone wants to hear. Next time, I am going to walk through the specific things a vet is actually checking for during a routine senior cat exam, the ones that take 30 seconds and catch problems most owners would never notice on their own until it was far too late to matter, including the one spot on a cat's body almost nobody thinks to check that told an entire second story about Butter I have never shared publicly until now.